Welcome back to another episode of SaaS Buyers Club. I'm your host, Omeed, and I'm the managing partner of Optimist Legal. Optimist Legal is a full service corporate law firm that helps SaaS founders with pretty much all things contracts, from incorporation to exit. If it has to do with contracts, that is what we help SaaS founders with. And I'm also the host of SaaS Buyers Club. And SaaS Buyers Club has a mission to deliver as much value as possible to SaaS founders to help them increase the values of their business. Because I believe that anything that provides insights to SaaS founders that can increase the value of their business will help them get better exits. Higher value, more value, bigger exit. So that's what we're here for. And how we do that is we interview the brightest minds in the space, thought leaders, VCs, SaaS founders who've exited, service providers. And with that, I am really excited to introduce Chris Hoffman, who Chris is the cap table master. He is the founder of Equity Admin Co., formerly at Carta, and he's pretty much the go-to resource for anything cap tables and equity. And I'm really pleased to have him on the show. Thanks for joining, Chris.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here with the coolest lawyer, by the way.
Oh man, thank you.
Coolest lawyer I've ever met. So
Yeah,
I appreciate all the kind words. Thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah. So is there anything else? Did I miss anything in the introduction? Is there anything you want to add?
Yeah, you were spot on.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I didn't know anything about this world of cap tables and equity until I happened to get a job at Carta, which is funny because I actually applied for about 100 jobs before that. I didn't really know anything about any of the companies. I was just like, I just need a little bit of a change. And Carta was the one to reply and said, okay, come on in for some interviews. And after 5 interviews, which I failed a couple of them, so I was still surprised that I still got the job. They hired me, and then all of a sudden I learned about this world. And it's cool because I always wanted to found a company. And I thought it'd be so cool to be a startup founder or work with startup founders in some way. And all of a sudden I was at Carta and I got to talk to them every day. I was like, this is cool. You guys are changing the world. And, some of those people that I talked to, it's been how long has it been? 6, 7 years now. And so now they're on to, really good things on a great trajectory. And so anyway, I'm getting off topic, but I didn't know anything about this space before that and fell into it and just fell in love with the world of cap tables, which kind of sounds kind of funny to a lot of people.
But they're important. And I'm curious. All right. So if I were to ask you, like, what's your hot take? Like, what's the message that you want SaaS founders to take away from today's episode?
Yeah, it's a great question. Get the cap table right from the beginning. Even if it's a little bit of an extra investment, even if it's a little bit extra due diligence, it's so critical. I mean, we'll probably talk about some of these things, but there are many mistakes, as you know, that can happen. It's very easy to mess it up, especially early on. And the fixing it later is way more time intensive, expensive, and all of the bad things than getting it right from the beginning and maintaining it along the way. So that's my big message for today and, for probably for a long time. Let's get it right from the start. Let's do it right from the beginning.
All right. So now, recognizing that that's the message, let's get the founders to that ultimate conclusion message. Like, what do they need to know to really understand getting cap tables right?
Yeah, there's a few things. Number one is make sure either you understand the incorporation documents when it comes to the cap table, right? Like the authorized shares amount, the restricted stock agreement that you get as a founder when you're first incorporating. And a lot of these services will include these documents in them. Make sure you understand those and or that you have additional people that understand those, like a great attorney who can understand these and interpret them for you. Advisors are helpful too in a lot of cases. One of the biggest things, and this is hopefully promoting you in a way, is finding an attorney who really understands startups, who understands venture-backed companies, who understands the type of company that you're in. Delaware C Corporation is oftentimes, right, what companies are registered as. And so having somebody who understands that, again, even if they're a little bit more pricey than your friend who's an attorney, but was like a personal injury attorney or something else. We've seen that before is incredibly important
You've
because
seen
as I
that?
didn't know
No
before.
way. You've seen that? Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. No way. Can't be.
As yeah, no, not at all. Um, it's just so important to have to understand what's going on in your cap table, just like the rest of your business, right? But the biggest thing is like the cap table is oftentimes left to the back burner. And you might have seen that. It's I don't really care about this thing until I need to care about it, like at a raise or at an exit or something like that. That's oftentimes the mentality. And oftentimes it's because either the founder is saying, well, my attorney fees are too expensive. So I don't really want to go to them to do tons of work on this yet until it's necessary, until I'm raising and have the money. Or I just don't really understand this. So I'm going to just push it off until later. But we've seen so many issues with that. And so getting that right from the beginning. And again, I know it's going to be an investment, oftentimes of money and of time, but it's important to do. It's just as critical as finding product market fit, right? Because you can go through a company's life cycle, you can do everything else right. And if your cap table is wrong, you might not get investment. Investors will look at it and say, oh, sorry, this is not something that I'll invest in.
Yep.
Or, an exit comes along or, you're going public down the road and there's either so much cleanup work or it's just not viable to do. And then all that money that you are making now from your product, right? A lot of it has to get funneled into correcting things or sometimes starting a new entity. I don't know. You might have seen that too. I've had clients who we've kind of told them what was wrong with their cap table and they've ended up starting a new entity and we're working with their attorneys to do so, of course, but it's just been so time intensive and expensive to do that. And so it's just right to understand it up front and to also get the help that you need. Again, founders have enough to worry about, right? They don't need to understand every single detail of every, legal document that they have, but they do need someone trusted who's done it before, hopefully multiple times on multiple occasions with other companies, who is that expertise in that area. And then if it's helpful to get advisors or consultants to also help you with that, then great. And that works.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. I mean, my whole thing is that as an attorney, tell all the clients that we help, like, don't make your attorney the like master of the knowledge. Like, even if you actually
yeah,
have someone that's super experienced on your team, like you're working with an incredibly experienced attorney, you still need to read your legal documents. You still need to understand, what your legal documents say. You still need to know how the legal documents operate.
yeah,
The benefit of that is like your lawyer can help guide you and help advise you and show you the playbook. But that doesn't mean that you should look to them as the sole source of information and knowledge about your own documents. Like, you need to know how those things
yeah.
operate. I think it's incredibly important. That attorney might leave,
Mhm.
whatever it is. In general, also knowing your own documents makes it so that you can navigate them. So you're not looking to your attorney to necessarily navigate them. You're working alongside your attorney to, get whatever outcome it is that you're looking to get. I
Yeah.
love that you started there. So it sounds like the first tip is know what's there. Know your authorized and issued shares, know the status of your documents and how, the issuances work, know your incorporating documents.
Yeah.
So that's step one, right?
There's one simple issue that I see that I hope this helps some founders. If maybe they're not working with an attorney yet and they're using a service that does the incorporation for them. There's one issue that we've seen a lot recently with new founders, and that's you authorize 10 million shares, for example. They end up issuing all 10 million to themselves. And they're going
Mhm.
into, they're about to go raise a financing round. And oftentimes you raise on safe notes or, something simple that isn't equity right up front. So you have a little time. But that's just an issue that we've seen a lot is all of the authorized shares are taken. And what that does is then you have to go and amend the authorized shares, increase them because you already hold all 10 million. So there's no room for an equity plan, an option pool. There's no room for future investors at that time. That's just one big issue that we see that I wanted to call out. So I hope that can help. Make sure that there are some authorized shares left over. If you're doing an incorporation by yourself, don't give them all to yourself up front. It's okay if you don't. That doesn't mean you own less than 100% of the company either, because that's usually the mindset behind it.
That's the difference between authorized and issued.
Yeah.
Okay, let's walk back even a little from there. What is it that Equity Admin Co. does?
A great question. Thanks for asking.
Yeah, of
we
course.
help companies. A lot of them are mid to late stage companies, but we've also worked with some earlier stage companies as well to essentially get that cap table right. So some of our companies, if we're talking a little bit later stage, they'll come to us with some cleanup work. So this is a very common thing where they say, hey, we've had, our HR folks are in there, our attorneys are in there, our finance people are in there. And I'm talking about in the cap table,
Yeah.
touching things, moving things
Yes.
around. They're using the software.
They're the ones that are responsible for managing the cap table.
Yeah. And there's a lot of hands in there. And then they say, and we've had, 2 law firms in the past. We're on our 3rd law firm. It's been 10 years, 5 years, whatever it may be. And they say, we just don't know if it's right. We have no idea. And we're looking forward to some kind of event, maybe a liquidity transaction, like a tender offer where employees can sell shares, or we're looking at an IPO or an acquisition. So can you guys come in here and just make sure everything's right? And that's a massive task for a 10-year company, looking at every single board consent, every single legal document that has to do with equity, every single restricted stock agreement, and just everything, employment agreements even, and do that work. So our later stage companies will come to us with that type of cleanup work. We'll help do that. The process may take a month or 2. And again, for earlier stage founders, this is a call out. Get it right from the beginning so you don't have to do this later on. We'll do that work for them, and then we'll continue doing ongoing work after that. So anytime there's option issuances, anytime there's terminations, anytime there are stock transfers, or anything that pertains to the cap table, that's not tax advice or legal advice. Those are things that we can help with. So at earlier stage founders, a lot of times we're helping them onboard onto a equity management software, getting everything set up right so that it's no longer in Excel. Because as we know, if everything's in Excel in the beginning, it's easy. You got 2 people, that's fine. But even then, I would argue, get as early as possible, get into an equity management software. So that's what we do. And then we also provide services like employee education for equity, financial reporting, so accounting for equity. We can help with those kind of things, and really anything that complements the cap table or equity that doesn't qualify as legal or tax advice. Those are things that we can help with.
So you are complete cap table managers, essentially.
Yeah, the term I think in the industry is fully outsourced equity administration, or stock administration is another one. Yeah.
That makes sense that you work mostly with enterprise, because enterprise is probably tinkering around in their cap table so often that they need like constant management.
Yeah, exactly. It's so much more activity than in the early stages. There's activity around raises. There's activity around, new option pool and new grants, but just not as much. And so that a lot of that work comes from the later stage. And it's been cool having that experience with later stage companies, because again, we can take what does work, what is working in these companies, what's not working, and then we can bring that knowledge back to the early stage founders and say, hey, these are the things that these companies have had issues with later on. And so avoid those if possible. Or here are some recommendations. Talk to your attorney about these.
Yeah. What are some of the things that you've seen that don't work for enterprise level that you've counseled early stage founders with respect to?
Yeah, there's some policies that are very, I would say, progressive, which is companies in the later stage, if a lot of them likely want to be more employee friendly. I would say a lot of our clients want to be employee friendly, so they give the option. Let's just give one example of a parental leave. So let's say when somebody has a child, companies can decide, what do you do with that? Do you stop the vesting for the employee who has maybe option grants or RSUs? Do we continue that? Do we give partial vesting? We've seen not only with parental leave, which I think is awesome, but because I have kids, so I appreciate that, but also with just leaves. So if companies allow these leaves, whether they're paid or unpaid, they say they then determine, how does the vesting work? The reason I'm bringing that up is because it's caused a lot of manual work to be done when somebody is allowed to leave and work part-time. The company policy is like, let's give them partial shares. So we have to adjust all their vesting schedule. And it extends it out an extra, 2 years. That's fine if it's a few employees, but when you have 1,000 employees doing that in a year, the time it adds up a lot. And so that's one of those. That's just one simple thing that I think it's really, really great to be employee first as a company, or serve your employees. I'd say also try to balance the serving your employees and doing the best for them, and also how much admin work is this going to take on our end as a company? Because if it's taken a lot more time on our end, you have to figure out, is that worth it to the company? Is it worth it to pay the extra money, whether to attorneys, to consultants, to your internal team, and use up their time to do these manual tasks versus helping the employee in the best way possible? That's one simple example. Another example is double checking. So when a round is happening, a financing round, so when you're going to raise some funds, making sure that you get a second opinion on how the round is happening. So let's say a company goes and raises a bunch of safe notes. It doesn't necessarily count as their pre-seed or their seed, but then they go to raise a year after that, and they raise a priced round, meaning those safe notes are then going to convert oftentimes into real shares.
Mhm.
And then the company's going to raise some more money and dilute the cap table in that way and issue more shares to investors. Unfortunately, we've had some clients who have trusted the wrong people to convert those shares for multiple rounds. And they didn't get a second opinion or someone to double check if those were right. And it resulted in the wrong amount of shares being converted to those investors. And this was for 2 rounds.
Such a mess.
It was, yeah, it's taken, doesn't have to take this long, but it's taken almost 2 years to resolve that, because one, we had to figure out what was right first. Then they had to take it to their new attorneys and say, will you check this? Will you sign off on it? Then they had to go to their investors who weren't aware of it yet and had to be notified, hey, everything's changing. And I don't know all the legal workings of this, and so I won't speak to that, but I know there was so much going on. So 2 years after that, we're finally getting the cap table right. We're redoing it all, getting it right, and now it'll
Did
be
the
right.
investors get more shares or less shares after the calculation was done? Because I'm sure that also really impacted those conversations. Like, how can you go to an investor and be
Yeah.
like, oh yeah, we gave you 100,000 shares, but yeah, about that, you're only going to get like 75,000.
Yeah. In this case, it was more. So the investors actually were getting a little bit more than they ever received. So that's a great news for an investor,
Yeah,
right?
great
Like,
news.
yeah,
Great news.
yeah, glad you fixed it. But it could be the opposite, right? It could be, hey, you're not getting as much and this is wrong. And then can you imagine, then all the investors, I can imagine all of their legal counsels going in and saying, we want to do this ourselves and check it
Yeah.
ourselves too.
Or I would imagine that they would be like, you know what? Let me just get my money back.
Yeah. Yeah. It could be wild. So that's another one, is getting that second opinion on things like that. Again, just like you said in the beginning, it's so important to get this right. It's so important to get your equity right, to get your cap table right, and keep it right along the way. There's a lot of consequences that can come. And most of them come with a lot of time and a lot of money spent later down the road.
And a lot of just impact in general.
Yeah.
Money, time, emotional frustration,
Yeah.
potential failure of objective, yeah, interesting. Okay, cool. So when do companies typically find you? I hear that it's later stage. It's usually probably around, as you mentioned, a liquidity event. So it's like they want to do a raise, they want to exit, yeah, there's some sort of event that's coming up that is requiring them to make sure that they have a cap table, usually probably because someone else is going to be looking at it. So, and that person has some sort of importance to them. But what stage? Is it typically Series A stage companies, or?
It's a good question. So we do get some Series A. I would say Series B and later is typically when they're realizing that, okay, we've hired a bunch of employees. we've kind of been handling it between, our legal counsel, maybe our GC, if they have one at that time, or, someone in finance. A lot of times CFOs kind of take on that work of managing the cap table. So I'd say about Series B is when it usually becomes a part-time job for someone, or it's too expensive, if they're using their attorneys and paralegals to do it. And so then they'll come to us. But oftentimes, you're exactly right. Oftentimes it's around some type of event. It's always when they realize how important it is. It's like, it's kind of, again, it's been put on the back burner. A lot of times we have CFOs come to us and say, hey, we haven't updated this in 6 months or a year. It's just, and again, I don't blame them, because it is a job. It is a part-time job until you're really late stage or you go public, then it becomes a full-time job. And so I don't blame them when they come to me and say, hey, I haven't updated this in a year.
What percentage of the companies that come to you are on like a cap table management platform, like a Carta or a Fidelity?
I'd say 98%. We've only had a couple clients who, only a couple clients who haven't been on a software. Sometimes they're managing it in both in Excel and in a software, which is really interesting to me. I've met attorneys who do that too at bigger law firms, where I'm like, why do you even have the software if this is more your source of truth? But yeah.
And for the companies that come to you who are on Excel but want to move to a cap table management platform, what does that process usually look like for you? What do founders need to know about moving from an Excel spreadsheet to a cap table management platform?
It's a great question. So you'll need all of the legal documents to support the data that you have in Excel. And again, earlier stage, it's easier, right? Which is usually when those companies are thinking about getting on. So incorporation documents, restricted stock purchase agreements, any board consents that you have, really anything that touches the equity, any equity plan documents you have if you set up an option pool. Those are the things that you'll need. So in addition to the Excel sheet, any documentation that's important to have, because the data is fine. That, if somebody's managing in something in Excel, that's great. I'm proud of you for managing it somewhere at least, but we'll need, and these equity management platforms as well will need the documentation to back it up. So it's kind of nice. A lot of the platforms they have an onboarding or an implementation to their platform included in their subscription if you're paying for it. There are platforms, there's a few, Cake Equity, Carta Launch, and who else? There's a few that let you get on for free until you've raised up to $1 million or until you have up to 25 different holders in your cap table. And so those are really helpful. But the paid versions, oftentimes the companies, I'd say in 90% of the cases, these equity management companies will include the onboarding and the implementation in there. So as long as you as a founder or an executive team have all of your legal documentation that goes into that supports that Excel data, that's what you'll need. I would argue also, if you have templates, some of these systems, as you've probably seen, they use templated agreements. So like an option agreement, for example, you'll put in a template in there, and then the system will either use the data that you input into the system to populate the template, or sometimes not. Sometimes it's just saying the source of truth is in the equity management system. And so if you have templates for that data too, you'll need those as well, oftentimes for these systems, to make sure that you can issue future grants without having to go through any DocuSign process or any of the processes that would be outside of one of those systems, because you don't want to manage that. We have clients who are very strict on their processes, and their attorneys are very strict on their processes, and they use a platform like Carta or like AngelList Equity, but then they're also getting those same agreements DocuSigned outside of those systems, and it's really just double the work. Like the reason you go to one of those platforms is to simplify. It's to have something where a lot of the pieces are automated. You don't have to touch Excel data or sheets or anything like that. So yeah, I would say, back to your original question, have the data, and then have the documentation that supports that data, as well as any possible future documentation, templates for board consents or option agreements or exercise agreements and things like that.
If a founder wanted to, like, if you were to offer a do-it-yourself program for founders where you give them like an SOP, here's how you do what Equity Admin Co does, let's say a founder wants to build an internal team or whatever, an internal function in their company to manage their cap table, what's like the do it yourself kind of process that you would suggest to the founders out there?
It's a great question. I haven't thought about that one before. It's a
I'm
good
thinking about
idea
it because
though.
I'm like, man, I want founders to like, get it. And I
Yeah.
found so often is like if you tell people how to do it, they'll realize like how much work it is, and they're like, oh my god, I don't want to do this.
You're not wrong. Yeah, yeah, that's so right. We were actually thinking of building something like it was kind of like a walkthrough for founders. I don't know if it'll happen, maybe someday. That does something like this. Let's see. The interesting thing with private companies, and I'll say this and then I'll get to the answer,
Mhm.
is that private companies, even though there's kind of set ways to do the cap table, right? You get oftentimes it's like restricted stock for the founders. When you introduce employees, maybe the first employee gets restricted stock, maybe not. Maybe you introduce the option pool, then they start getting options. Vesting schedules are very typical, a 4-year vesting schedule with a 1-year cliff. Some of those are changing these days to make it longer for founders, to have them more invested for the investors. But there's like kind of typical things to do. Authorized 10 million shares is a very common one amongst big law firms to do. But at the same time, unlike the public markets, private markets are very fluid. You can really do a lot of different things. Like if you
Mhm.
choose to, I know it's going to be a bigger burden on maybe the attorney or someone managing it, but you could do some crazy things with your equity. You could give random cliffs. You could give a 1-month cliff or a 5-year cliff. So those rules aren't set. So I would say as kind of an overarching SOP to do it yourself, it would be always make sure you have the legal documentation first. And that includes, and I'm going to include board consent in that as well. Things always have to be approved by the board. And that is an issue that we see oftentimes with earlier stage companies. And I mean, you're like, yeah, I see that every day. I'm sure. Is getting those board consents, getting the board to approve it. Even if you are the sole board member as the founder, you got to have that board documentation to back up anything
Mhm.
that you're going to be putting into your cap table, right? And so get the board consent, make sure you have any legal documentation. Those are the first two things I'd say. So if you're granting options to a new employee or to a handful of new employees, you always got to get that board consent, approved by the board first. And oftentimes that approval date then becomes the grant date for those options. You got to make sure you have your option agreement. So if you are doing it outside of a software, make sure you have the option agreement filled out and then signed by the employee, but filled out with the information the employee needs. Hopefully you're using the equity management system, and then that can be a little bit more automated for you, and you can just have the template in there and then have the data within that software. So make sure you have the board consent, make sure you have the option agreement or any agreement that goes into it, restricted stock agreement if you're granting restricted stock. And then I would also say if you are the one entering it as a founder, like let's say you're using a software, you enter all the data, you have the board consent, you've got the agreement, you enter the data in there now, it's all right. Have someone double check it. Have someone, if you've got a finance executive, if you got a fractional CFO, if you have your attorney, of course, if you have a fractional
And
counsel.
when you say check it, what should founders be looking for when they're double checking? Where could the potential mistakes be made?
Good question. So always check, it could be simple as the name, make sure the name is the legal name that's on the templates, right? Make sure you got the right share amount or the option amount. Make sure you have the correct vesting schedule, because vesting schedules can be tricky. And even if it's a simple one, if you mess it up by saying the cliff is 15 months instead of 12 months, that's going to change things, especially if you're using the software. So checking the name, the share amount, the vesting schedule. There's other things that is more in the legal realm, I'd say. Like there's something called a federal exemption. For the founders that aren't aware, because these are not public equities, right? Because these companies are not public companies, they have to issue the shares under certain exemptions, which means, hey, I don't have to register it. I'm not public. So that's something to check with your attorney as well, is make sure it's issued correctly and under a certain exemption that allows it so that you don't have to actually register it with the SEC, because that'd be a major pain.
I love this,
especially for
man.
an early stage.
This is
Let's see if
music
there.
to my ears.
I'm glad. I'm glad. I'm sure you're dealing with these things on the daily.
Yeah,
Because
I'm just glad someone else says it because like it gets repetitive as the attorney, so it's just like really nice to
yeah,
talk to another person who like says it who actually isn't even an attorney. So I don't know why, but I feel like sometimes founders, if they like hear it from another founder, for example, they're sometimes more likely to believe it than
yeah,
hearing it from their own attorney. Like, oh, I heard this,
that's true.
my friend is a founder and blah blah blah. So I'm like, man,
Yeah.
I'm your lawyer and I'm telling you that's not the case. Like, I heard it over here. Read it on a Google article, whatever.
I love that. Yeah. So I think those are the things. Those are the things to double check and have somebody else double check it, right? Some companies, you look at the cost of legal services. Oftentimes, if attorneys are billing hourly rates, oftentimes if you're working with a big law firm, right, you're getting these big rates. As long as your attorney is aware and approves of things that are being done that pertain to the legal space, I would say that's the most important. You don't have to have them, you don't have to have them enter all the information. That's something, honestly, founders can do that at the early stage. It's not a problem.
Mhm.
Just make sure that they're aware. Just make sure that they're, if you, just having them check it, just having them review it, it's going to reduce your legal costs a lot, but it's also going to save you a lot down the line. If your person is saying, yes, this is right, you did it right, or here are some changes that need to be done.
Awesome. So continuing down the list of the SOP, we got make sure you got the legal paperwork. Double check. Was that number 2 or was that number 3?
Yeah, I guess number 3, because number 2 would be making sure to enter, if you're using the software, hopefully you are, enter that information from the option agreement or agreement
Yes.
into the system. And then, yeah, number 3, have someone double check it who understands. Number 4, I would say, because that's getting your cap table updated. As if you have that done, then your cap table is updated. Number 4, I would say, and this is a reason that a lot of it gets put on the back burner, a lot of times it's wrong later on down the line, is because I think audits are important to do frequently. So an audit, and I'm talking about, again, I don't think founders usually do this, especially if they're the ones entering it, have someone else do it. But I think if you have a lot of equity activity or things are starting to heat up a little bit, maybe do monthly audits. I don't think those are too necessary in the early stage. I think maybe quarterly or semi-annual audits where you take the legal documentation that you have that pertains to the cap table and you go and just check it. And I would say have someone check it. It could be a fractional CFO. It could be your general counsel. It could be your internal, your external legal counsel. But check those things along the way. That's another thing that, we find and we kind of encourage our clients to do is after we've audited it, if they want to take on the administration again, which is totally fine. And I'm talking more later, like mid to later stage. If they want to take on that administration later on, after we audit it, we say, please, double check your work. Have someone who understands it, double check the work as you're going, but also, on a monthly basis or on a quarterly basis. Look back at what's happened and make sure it's right. It's going to save so many hours down the line. One thing the early stage founders, I think, don't think about are audits from big firms like KPMG or EY or Deloitte. That a lot of the work we do has to do with audits. Companies are like, hey, I'm going through an audit. And again, I don't know if this is right. And the auditors are going to tell me what's wrong, but that's also expensive. That's very expensive to go through an audit. And auditors will look at, a lot of aspects of your business, but the cap table being one of the biggest ones. And if it's not right, again, they're going to look at it. They're going to have a lot of meetings with you. It's going to be costly. It's going to take a lot of time. Whereas if they can look at it and say, oh yeah, everything looks right. It looks clean because you've been doing your SOPs and you've been auditing the cap table yourself along the line. It'll be so much cleaner and so much smoother and cost a lot less to do so.
Is there anything else in the SOP or is that everything?
Yeah, that's everything. It sounds really simple, right? It's like, oh yeah.
I was just going to say that.
It's like, this is easy. And that is the mindset that happens.
Oh God. Step 5 maybe is, just keep it like I think the monthly audit addresses this, but like, yeah, obviously anytime you issue equity or have any sort of equity conversations, you just need to be constantly like updating your cap table, which is, if you're monthly auditing, you probably are doing that. But I just felt like it was important to add that in there, But to recap the steps is like, make sure that all of your legal paperwork is there in terms of the actual issuances and the board resolutions. Once the legal paperwork is there, use a cap table management software other than an Excel spreadsheet. Double check all of your entries into the management software. Conduct regular audits of your entries. And then, just maintain the cap table as you move along, and, any conversations, whether they're verbal or otherwise, some email that you sent to someone with some terms of equity that you're going to grant at some point needs to be documented in the cap table. Like all of those understandings and agreements need to be on paper, signed, and entered into the cap table.
Simple, right? Easy peasy.
Yeah, right.
You're exactly right. I mean, when you said earlier that you give the instruction, oftentimes someone then realizes how much it becomes. I think this is one of those perfect scenarios. In the beginning, it is simple, and we have had clients who have come very early stage, and they've said, I just want to understand a little bit more about this, and so we'll walk them through things. And they go, okay, yeah, I think I could do this myself, but I'll let you know if I get caught up in anything. And, honestly, you can. I think at early stage, you can handle a bit of it yourself as long as you have the backup, as long as you have, I like to call this the accountability partner. It's really helpful to have an accountability partner in a lot of aspects of life, someone holding you accountable, especially if you're a founder. And so I think that's important to have that accountability partner or partners with your cap table as well.
Totally. I mean, it's easy if it's just you and your co-founder, and you've got, the founder's stock agreements in place.
Yeah.
You actually don't even need an Excel spreadsheet. Now, I'm not saying that you shouldn't have one. I'm saying that even then, you still should maintain a cap table. But if there's only like, 2 stock agreements, for example, the cap table only really becomes super important, once you've got an option plan in place, and now you're starting to, distribute fractions of, equity, pretty much like 0.001% of the company, or 0.00001% of the company and you're scaling your employees, and you're constantly issuing offer letters with some grant offers. Then you really need to have it dialed in, because that's where it can get really messy. And especially for things like, fundraisers for exit modeling, to understand, the impact of exits. If you start bringing investors on, for the exit modeling, there is going to be really important. Investors are not even going to invest in your company if there isn't a cap table. The first thing they're going to want to see, one of the first things they're going to want to see is the cap table. So for all the founders out there, I think we've covered quite a good amount of ground with respect to cap tables, Chris.
Do you mind if I say 2 more things that you reminded me of?
Please go ahead.
Okay, so this goes back to your question about what are some things to avoid, or what are some things that you should think about that you don't really think about in the beginning. When you said fraction, that reminded me. Don't take this as legal advice, but please never do fractional shares. It is such a headache, and it might seem great in the beginning. Sometimes companies incorporate with too few shares, like let's say 1,000 shares instead of 10 million. And so they're like, oh, we'll just do fraction of shares. One, most equity management softwares will not handle that well at all. So that's a problem, because as you grow, you need one of those softwares. But 2, it just gets so messy. It's so messy. So, and when I say fractional shares, I'm saying not fraction of the company, like you said, but saying, hey, I'm going to give this or grant this.
Yeah, like a quarter of a share.
Like 100.67 shares, because that equates to this perfect percentage that I'm trying to give. So anyway, again, not legal advice, but please never do that. That's my one recommendation.
All right, Chris. Well, thanks so much for joining today. Is there like a last message you want to leave all the founders out there with?
Yeah, it's really what we've been talking about all along, but just the importance of get your cap table right from the start. Um, Make sure you're working with people who are knowledgeable, both about your industry, but then also about the cap table, the equity side of it, the legal side of it, who understand the legal side of your business, especially when it comes to the cap table, and start, get it right from the beginning. Just like you were saying, it's easy to manage it in an Excel sheet. If it's two people, you don't even need to really, right? If it's just one person or two people. But I would argue get on a cap table management software as soon as you incorporate. Get those shares on. Actually, some of these softwares now have a cool tool where you can drop documents in there and then it will use AI, right, to just create your cap table for you. So there's really no excuse anymore. And especially if you're looking to raise anytime soon, make sure that that's done. Make sure you're on a system. Make sure you're on somewhere that you can send to your investors or potential investors for their due diligence. So get it right from the beginning. That's my message today. That's my message for probably the rest of my life, or as long as I'm doing this, is get it right and keep it right.
Awesome. Yes. Super important. Follow Chris's 5 steps to manage your cap table as well that you can obviously got from this episode. But also make sure you follow Chris. Follow Chris on LinkedIn. He's got some super cool content that he does. The Cap Table Kid, which I love. I'm always commenting on all
Thank
those
you.
on all those posts. Follow him. His social media will be in the show notes below. And Chris, thanks again so much for joining this week.
Thank you. This was a pleasure and it's so good to be here. So thank you very much.
Absolutely. Everyone out there, this has been another episode of SaaS Buyers Club. Make sure subscribe, like, comment, share. Let us know what you took away from the episode today. Let us know any guests you want to see on the show moving forward, and we'll see you next week.